Okay, so today we're going to be talking about immigration. And the title of the lesson is The Debate Over Immigration, because as you are aware, this is an ongoing discussion. And one of the popular questions in regards to this category is, should new laws restrict or expand the amount of people coming into our country? And let's get some background on that.
When I was in Nicaragua, all my childhood was great. Used to spend Christmas, all my family. I wish I was there with all of them. I wish I had them here. I wish I had them on the table for Thanksgiving. All my family here.
My grandfather was born in Russia, and when he was 9 years old, him and his family decided to move with the revolution. And he had to walk all the way to France through guides, over the mountains, just like Miguel. And when he got to this country, he went to school, dropped out in the 8th grade because he had to work. He worked packing fruits for 35 years. He worked 16-hour days. He worked 6 days a week. He rarely saw his kids. But he came for one purpose, so that his children, and his father came to the United States so that his child could do well, and my grandfather wanted to give the same thing to my parents.
My great-grandparents were admitted because the country needed cheap labor. I might not be here if my great-grandparents hadn't been admitted, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't be doing wonderfully somewhere else.
I'm the daughter of immigrants. I'm married to an immigrant. My parents are the most American people you can get. They made a decision to become Americans, and they took an oath when they became U.S. citizens. They chose to become Americans, and that makes it, in my view, that makes it particularly special in their case.
I am an American. That's all that matters. It doesn't matter what my heritage is. I am an American.
A little background. We've had debates over immigration throughout our entire country's history. In fact, some of the earliest documented ones contain comments from Ben Franklin, who expressed concern about the number of German immigrants who were moving into Pennsylvania. Nativist movements date back to the earliest parts of our country. In fact, in the 1830s, there was an America First campaign, which also expressed itself in the 1920s. During that time, we saw a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. We saw the anti-Red Scare, fear of communism, fear of immigrants in general. We also saw at this time the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there have been a number of anti-immigrant hostilities and anti-immigrant laws passed. Now, today's Americans are very divided on the issue. Some side with perspectives like former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, who said, and I quote, "Immigrants challenge us with new ideas and perspectives." Others, perhaps, are represented by Dan Stein of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, who said, and I quote, "Large-scale immigration is not serving the needs and interests of the country." And so on one hand, you have many Americans who support the idea of more people coming into our country, and then on the other hand, you have people who say this flow of immigrants into our country should be restricted. But I wanted to point out, especially here with German immigrants, that even people from Western European nations have been discriminated against. Typically, whatever group of people are coming in large numbers are looked down on by those who were there before. And we call that nativism. Now, between the 1900s, between the year 1900 and the 1940s, 16 million European people came into the United States alone. That means just from Europe, that many people were coming into the United States. Now, most of the factors driving people to this part of the world were economic troubles or rapid population growth in their countries. Now from Asia and Latin America, between 1970 and 1998, in the latter half of the 20th century, is when immigration from the Western Hemisphere, particularly Central America, began to ramp up. During this time, the immigrant population tripled to 26 million people who are what we call first-generation immigrants, meaning have moved here within their lifetimes.
The United States of America has been called a nation of immigrants, a product of the many millions who have immigrated to its shores.
There was an overarching national need to populate the wilderness throughout much of the early 19th century. Immigration played an important historic role in helping to populate a wilderness. It helped us project jurisdiction. It helped us build a nation.
Tension about immigrants has always been true in this country. I mean, people in the early part of the century were worried about Italians and Poles and Eastern European Jews because they thought these folks aren't going to become Americans. They're too different from us. Well, now you see the sons and daughters and the grandsons and the granddaughters of those Italians and Poles and Eastern European Jews, and they're marrying each other. And you see them walking down the street, and all you see are Americans.
Most immigrants have come here as a result of the demand for cheap labor. 100 years ago, after the Civil War, Booker T. Washington said to the capitalists in the North, he said, "Gentlemen," he said, "put your buckets down here." He meant, with the extraordinary labor demands of the Industrial Revolution, recruit the former slaves and their children up to the cities to do those jobs. They said, "No, we're going to go overseas, Ireland, Southern Europe, to bring that labor here." That flow that we, in a misty-eyed way today, call the Ellis Island flow, most of that flow was generated by labor contractors who wanted cheap labor.
In the period between 1880 and 1920, folks who wanted to come could come, with the exception, by the way, of Asians who were forbidden explicitly from coming to the United States. We had some pretty racist laws on the books at the time. But if you were from most parts of Europe, you could come and you were welcome.
In the 1920s, Congress passed laws restricting the flow of immigrants to the United States. These laws mandated a drastic reduction in the flow of immigrants to 150,000 per year. The amount allowed to enter from each country of origin was based on 1890 census figures. Those limits stood until the 1965 immigration bill.
In 1965, Congress inadvertently set off the single largest sustained wave of immigration in American history, and nobody knows why.
We chose in 1965 to allow U.S. citizens to bring their family members if they promise to take care of them. That policy has made absolute sense. The results of that policy have been very positive. You don't need much infrastructure to help these people adapt if they're coming in because a family member sponsored them. Because what does a family member do? Gives them a home, helps them find a job, helps them adjust to the educational system. So we're not only doing the right thing, but we're doing the practical thing by basing our system on family relationships. If we bring in somebody who doesn't have any connections to the United States, anybody that they know in the United States, you're back to the situation where somebody gets off the boat and doesn't know what to do when they get here.
Now, you ask Americans, you say, why do we need more people today? Are we trying to fill up a wilderness? No. Is there a big labor shortage in this country? Most people say no. Are we trying to fill up all our prime farmland with people? Most people say no. Not enough traffic on the highways? Beachfront property going begging? Water tables too high in Texas and the West? Wilderness parkland areas not crowded enough? Do we need more people encroaching on the wilderness and the parklands? Are we trying to build Napoleon's grand army to sweep down and conquer Latin America? We don't have a national interest in sustained high immigration today.
We have concluded that a properly regulated legal immigration system is in the national interest. Immigration is not a right guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution to everyone anywhere in the world who thinks they want to come to the United States. Immigration is a privilege. It is a privilege granted by the people of the United States to those we choose to admit.
And so you got to hear some interesting perspectives from people in positions of power on this issue. Now, of course, one of the chief issues with immigration in our country today is the issue of illegal immigrants, those coming over by illegal means. Today, there are around 12 million illegal immigrants living in the United States. Most have jobs, but these jobs receive low pay and no benefits. Some stores, restaurants, companies will hire illegal immigrants, but they pay them far lower wages. Some illegal immigrants, as condition of their passage from their country of origin to the United States, agree to work in sweatshops for slave wages. Some wind up working in brothels. Some wind up being victims of human trafficking. Some are murdered or sold into slavery on the way. Passage for someone coming into our country illegally is very expensive, sometimes costing up to $15,000, $20,000, and very dangerous. Although these illegal immigrants do not pay taxes, in many cases they do often qualify for government-funded services, such as education, such as health care. And this has also been the subject of many debates. We learned previously about Proposition 187, and I'd like to explore this law just a little bit with you. In 1994, the governor of California, the state perhaps with the highest concentration of immigrants in the United States, said, and I quote, "There is a right way to come to America, and there is a wrong way." Regardless of how you feel about that, that was the governor of the state of California. Now, the same year, California voters approved Prop 187. This law denied illegal immigrants access to any publicly funded services, such as public education or state-funded health care. It was ruled unconstitutional by federal courts. In 1996, a law tightened illegal immigration restrictions, and yet today we are still debating this very same issue. And so we have two sides to the debate. On one hand, you have people who favor limits to immigration. Many of these people claim that immigrants are taking jobs from America. However, I'd like to cite some evidence to the contrary. Data suggests that immigration has not hurt the economy. In fact, it may actually help to fuel economic growth. For example, unemployment in 1980 was at 7.1%. In 2001, unemployment has fallen to 4.3%. And today it hovers between around 6%. And yet, this is even as millions of immigrants have come into the country. And so, correlation doesn't equal causation. However, the data suggests that there has been no statistically significant impact on unemployment by means of immigration. Next, wages. Economists agree that immigrants tend to work for lower wages than that of native-born Americans. History has shown us that. In fact, 1/3 of the income gap, what we define as the gap between the rich and the poor, over 1/3 of those living in the poverty level are immigrants. And that's one perspective. However, I would counter by saying other factors such as foreign trade, declining union membership, and new technology also play a great role in this income gap.
Neng Lor, a 23-year-old from Laos, lives in a community of Hmong immigrants in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Neng came to this country in November 1994 after spending most of his childhood in United Nations refugee camps in Thailand. Neng's father fought alongside American soldiers during the Vietnam War. After the fall of Saigon, Neng's father was forced to run for his life. He went into hiding in the forest with his wife and their 2-year-old son, Neng.
The life in the forest is very difficult. Sometimes we have no food to eat. We have to eat the leaves of the trees.
The threat of being captured by the North Vietnamese, which meant possible jail, torture, or even death, kept Neng's family in hiding for 4 years.
After 4 years in the forest, Neng's father decided to attempt the dangerous journey to the Mekong River, where his family could cross into Thailand. After arriving in Thailand, they were admitted into their first UN refugee camp. It was the beginning of 13 years in 4 different camps. After spending most of his childhood in refugee camps, Neng decided his family should try to emigrate to a new life in America. In order for Neng's family to emigrate to America, Neng knew he would need to marry someone who had a family connection in the United States.
That's why I decided to get married very early. So my wife, she has an older sister who lived in Minnesota. So she can sponsor for us. So we have a chance to come to the United States.
3 years after marrying a 14-year-old girl whose sister lived in Minnesota, Neng's family's visa applications were approved.
In November 1994, after 13 years in refugee camps and 4 years in the forest, Neng and his family flew to St. Paul, Minnesota to begin a new chapter in their lives.
I hope that in the future, my children, they can study more and they can have a chance to become a nurse or security or like a computer. They can study more, they can become a doctor, lawyer, something like that. I hope that.
The Hmong community in Minnesota is an example. Minnesota is a pretty white part of the country. These folks are, the folks who populate that part of the country are, largely descendants of European immigrants. And churches in particular have opened their hearts and their communities to refugees fleeing Southeast Asia and the wars that have been fought there in the last several decades. And it's transforming communities in Minnesota, and everybody, it's a positive change. And it's because people in America were willing to open their hearts to people who were fleeing for their lives.
We're admitting an immigrant today, and then we're turning around and letting that immigrant in time bring not only spouses and unmarried minor children, but married minor children, and adult sons and daughters, and married adult sons and daughters, and parents and married parents, and then married brothers and sisters who turn around and do the same thing. And creating long chains of family migration into the millions that go on, and backlogs are created that go on for 40 and 50 years.
Well, let's look at the facts. If I bring my brother, it takes 15 years for him to get a visa. Then it takes him at least 5 years before he can become a U.S. citizen, and his wife can become a U.S. citizen. And most people wait 10 years. So 25 years have gone by before she's even eligible to bring a family member. And then if she tries to bring a family member, it's another 15 years before they can get a visa. By the time the links in this chain are eligible for visas, 120 years have gone by, and most of the people you're talking about are dead.
There is no credibility to an immigration system that goes on for 40 years. And to say that that 40-year backlogs mean that there's no chain migration it's like saying there's no rush at the deli because everyone's standing around holding numbers. Students have to understand today, young people today, the enormity of the growth of migration pressure, of people who want to come here. To understand the potential for abuse of any immigration system. If we give U.S. citizens the ability to bring anyone from around the world they marry, you're going to have a problem with marriage fraud.
I don't think anybody condones folks who get into sham marriages in order to get in the United States. That's not, it's not the right thing to do. It's against the law, and I don't think anybody condones that. On the other hand, the fact that somebody was driven to do this says a number of things. One, it says America is still terrific enough that people are willing to take incredible risks to come here, and at some level we ought to be proud of that. And two, it says that our door is shut too tightly.
Now, the United States has always held a special exemption status for, quote, highly skilled immigrants. The current law allows up to 195,000 highly skilled immigrants to enter the country each year. Many businesses have asked Congress to increase this number. And here's the irony, and I quote, "The U.S. has this terrible problem. The smartest people in the world want to come here." Obviously, he's making light of the fact. Another concern, and these are concerns that many people feel. Many immigrants never become citizens and so fail to completely participate in American life. Yet I'd like to throw some numbers at you. In 1970, 64% of people who had moved within their lifetimes had gained citizenship. In 1997, only 35% were able to do so. Now, the reason for this decline. Number one, we have rising numbers of people coming to the country illegally. Number two, as you saw in the clip, there was a backlog of applications. But politicians have used these numbers and fabricated these ideas that there is a, quote, presumed lack of interest. People like to point out that the U.S. citizenship oath carries with it responsibilities, and that illegal immigrants will not fulfill these responsibilities. Well, you see, you have to understand they are not able to fulfill these responsibilities, such as voting or serving on juries or military service, because they are backlogged with millions of other people waiting for citizenship status. There are also cultural concerns. You will hear people say, America is losing its identity. We have no common culture. Now you hear this in more offensive ways. Whites are going to be in the minority. Speak English if you're going to come here. Usually that's from people who don't know how to speak good English anyway. But you see, some even say that too many people are coming here, as you've heard in the clips. But I'd like to counter by pointing out that in 1910, the percentage of immigrants was much higher than it was today. So I don't know what those, quote, good old days that old people talk about are. Because our percentage of immigrants is actually lower than what it was previously.
In 1989, at the age of 10, Miguel Delgado, his brother and father, left Nicaragua and came to the United States in search of a better life.
My father wanted a better life for his entire family. That was the main reason why my father brought us here.
The Delgados crossed the border from Mexico with a group of illegal aliens. Crawling through the brush with helicopters flying overhead, with INS trucks driving nearby, Miguel and his family were in constant fear of being caught.
I was afraid of getting caught. I knew it was wrong. I don't blame my father, because he didn't have no other choice. But he thought it was going to be easy, and it wasn't. Because for the first 2 years, he had to work in a factory where he was making less than $200. And for the first 2 years, I was living with my aunt, her family. And he didn't even have money to give us food. So my aunt fed me and my brother and him. My mother stood there. She stood in Nicaragua.
Miguel's mother stayed behind in Nicaragua for 2 years until his father had made enough money to send for her to join them in the United States.
After his mother arrived in the country, Miguel's family moved to an apartment in the Bronx.
After 2 years that we were here, my father sent for her. She came through the same thing. Then now we got our own apartment. And we only have to pay $300 of rent, but the price of that is being in a neighborhood that you can't even go out. I cannot go out at night. I cannot go out in the afternoon because there's drug dealers out the corner selling drugs like they're selling candies. They say America's the dream. Come and get it. It's open to everyone. So why couldn't my father get a job where he'd get more than $4 an hour? I feel that the people that hire immigrants taking advantage of them because they know that there's no other way out. They know that they're going to take whatever they offer them. That's not fair because they don't come here to get a low pay. They come here to get a better life. Why did we have to live in a room with an apartment with 11 people? It was just, I was disappointed. I know my father was disappointed. It's not his fault. He didn't know it was going to be this hard.
After 6 years and thousands of dollars in legal fees, Miguel and his family became legal residents in early 1996.
The first thing I thought was, I get a job now. All the money they spend, now they know that it was not in vain. I think for everything, he's the greatest man I know. My mother too is supportive. And I love them both. That's why I want to pay them back. Go to college, get an education, take them out to a better place where she won't have to worry about violence.
I think that we have to change the attitude that because someone speaks, a Spanish, that does not make them lower in the economic or social scale. I think your immigration depends on who's coming. Pat Buchanan asked a question, or said, no Jose, no more Jose.
Pat Buchanan and others are responding by saying, what's wrong with this picture? Why don't we move back to the original default position, which is no immigration unless we need it? And the only way you can achieve that, because of the never-ending chain migration process of relatives joining relatives, is to say, stop, let's take a breather, let's take a time out to absorb and assimilate the 20 or 30 million immigrants we've admitted since 1965 and have a national debate.
The folks arguing that we ought to take a break are also folks arguing that they don't like the ethnic makeup of current immigrants. They're suggesting that today's immigrants are not really becoming Americans, and all of the evidence shows the opposite of that. We have in my neighborhood Latinos, immigrants, protesting because an adult education center is going to be closed. Why are they protesting? Because that's the center that they go to learn English. We wouldn't be having that happen if immigrants were not eager to assimilate.
No one has ever shown in the immigration context that there is, across the entire immigration system, bias based on ethnicity, race, or national origin. Nevertheless, assuming it exists, the way to handle it is by uniform requirements for documentary verification. If, when an employer hires you, they're all required to ask for the same document, run it through the same machine reader, and get the same approval code, okay? It's your picture, I get an approval code, just like a credit card transaction. If it's later shown you're an illegal alien, that approval code is my complete defense as an employer.
We just had a raid in Los Angeles of a sweatshop where the employer had enslaved the workers. The workers were actually living there as slaves. Do you think that if we create a verification system, that employer is going to say, oh gosh, I better verify all these people? Of course not. They were hiring illegal immigrants on purpose because it was a source of cheap labor. And creating this sort of fancy high-tech system isn't going to fix that. You enforce the border, you go after people who overstay their visas, and you go after employers who are deliberately breaking the law. There's a reason that Congress doesn't want to do those things, and part of the reason for that is that those very employers, the agricultural industry, the garment industry, other industries in this country, rely on these workers, and they're not interested in having the laws enforced against them.
But we are a country of laws. For our immigration policy to make sense, it is necessary to make distinctions between those who obey the law and those who violate it. Therefore, we disagree with those who would label any effort to control illegal immigration as somehow inherently anti-immigrant. Unlawful immigration is not acceptable.
More cultural concerns. One concern, and again, whether you feel these are real concerns or not, these are things people feel, that immigrants do not mix with other groups, forming ethnic neighborhoods that divide society, that people segregate themselves by default. And I would counter by saying others believe that immigrants enrich American life, that maybe it takes a generation or two for people to assimilate. But it does increase the diversity of our lives. That we are all the product of immigrants, and that we are all the product of multinational ethnicities. Many of us have ancestors from several different countries of origin. And that just shows that with time, assimilation does occur naturally, and diversity does increase as a result. Now, there are also many moral issues to consider with immigration. For one, we are currently experiencing a refugee crisis where there are terrible things going on in parts of the world. And there are people coming here seeking asylum. And this means they hope to find a safe place because they are fleeing a government that is oppressive. Now, immigration is currently allowed for political asylum. However, often those fleeing poverty or famine are turned away. And quote, poorly paid officials must make these decisions that the best and brightest of us would be stumped on. How do you decide who to accept, who to turn away? How do you decide whose lives will be forever changed and who must go back to these terrible places? Some rules allow relatives of immigrants to enter. One concern from Representative Lamar Smith of Texas, he believes that these rules admit immigrants who, quote, have no marketable skills and end up living on the system. And so policymakers have to balance concerns about the number of immigrants coming in, and they have to balance this with families who want their loved ones to be safe and to be prosperous and to come here. Alan Simpson's plan was to slow immigration for 5 years to gain, quote, breathing space. You've heard this from Dan Stein's perspective in the video clips. Polls show that most Americans oppose this idea, believing it should be kept at the present level or increased.
They'll come no matter what. You can build a 100-foot fence. You can put troops at the border. They will come. There's nothing you're going to do to stop them. They're not coming for one specific reason. They're not coming here because they want to destroy Americans' lives. They want to come here because for the same reasons that my grandfather came here, that my mother came here, and that most people come to better their lives. And they see the United States as a way of reaching to the next level. And we don't have the right to stop anybody who wants to come here, who almost dies to come here, the chance to become free in an open society and do well.
With all kinds of extraordinary migration pressure, there are perhaps 400 to 500 million people who around the world today, if you let them, would move here. They'd like to move here to a country whose social safety net, whose available public education, welfare services, retirement programs, medical care are perhaps 15 or 20 times the average annual income in their home countries. My goodness, who wouldn't want to make that move?
These are folks who had the gumption to leave everything they know, to leave the place where they speak the language, the place where they grew up, the place where they understand how things work, to come to a place where they don't speak the language, where they have to learn how to get around, and a place which is very often hostile to them. The people who have the spunk to do that are people who have the ability to really make it. And we ought to, however you feel about immigrants, you ought to admire that kind of courage.